I was told to be careful, that no one wanted to be posted there, because there was something in the forest, something I would definitely hear, and if I had very bad luck, I would see. A woman who moved through the treetops. Tonight's stories are about soldiers, a topic we know fascinates you, frightens you, but that you love all the same, like all our stories. But not only that, besides talking about ghosts, the ghosts of memory and souls in torment, of witches, and more, we'll also take a moment for a story about a curse that has followed someone in this community for years, and who still doesn't know how to escape it and find peace again. I warn you, if you listen, you most likely won't be able to sleep tonight. And if you dream that I'm telling you a story, one you've never heard here, one that crosses through this screen, this device, that is no longer the fault of this podcast. Perhaps it's a sign that you're about to become the protagonist of the next tale of the night. This happened when I was stationed at a military camp in the mountains, in an area bordering two of the most dangerous states in Mexico. I won't say exactly where, but it's a complicated region. Not so much because of armed confrontations, but because of what the local people said roamed the hills. Inside the base, there was a watch post that almost no one wanted to cover. It was a small clearing surrounded by very tall trees, and from that position you could see a dirt road winding down towards several villages in the mountains. The reason no one wanted that post had nothing to do with ambushes or firefights. It had to do with something several soldiers swore they had heard, and some even claimed to have seen. They called her the Lady of the Trees. They said that on certain early mornings you could hear laughter coming from among the treetops, a woman's laugh that definitely wasn't coming from the ground. It came from above, from among the branches. At first, I thought it was just a story made up to scare the new recruits, the kind of tale that always shows up when you're out in the hills, until that post fell to me, and my shift was in the early morning hours. I went up with a fellow soldier who would relieve me later. We walked 15 minutes along a trail until we reached the clearing where the watch post was. Then he left me alone, but before he went, he said something that stuck with me. That if I heard someone laughing, I shouldn't look up, no matter what. I asked him why. He just shrugged and told me that sometimes you ended up seeing someone. Then he left. The first while passed quietly. The mountains were completely dark that night. You couldn't see a thing. You could barely hear the insects in the wind moving through the trees. After a while, I started to hear something else. It was as if someone were moving through the branches of the pines. I figured it might be animals, squirrels, an opossum, something like that. But then I heard the laugh. It was a low laugh, like someone trying to hold it back. It came from up in the trees. I felt that kind of cold that has nothing to do with the weather. I remembered what they had told me and tried to ignore it. But the laugh came again, this time clearer and closer. I don't know how much time passed before I did exactly what I'd been warned not to do. I looked up, and there she was. There was a woman among the branches of one of the pines. She was sitting very high up, where the branches are already thin, too thin to hold a person's weight. She was wearing something dark, like a shawl or a long dress, and she was laughing. She wasn't moving. She was simply there, looking down. I stayed completely still, not knowing what to do. At some point, she raised a hand and pointed toward the dirt road we were watching, then laughed again. Instinctively, I looked down toward the road. I saw nothing, and when I looked back up at the tree, she was gone. I thought maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me, but a few minutes later I heard engines, several of them, with no lights on. 3 pickup trucks were slowly making their way down the mountain road, headlights off, only the sound of the engines. I radioed it in, and the base mobilized immediately. The trucks stopped when they spotted military movement on the road, then turned around and disappeared back into the hillside trails. When my shift ended, I went back to base and told one of the sergeants what had happened. He didn't seem surprised. He only asked me one thing: whether I had seen her up in the trees. I told him yes. The sergeant went quiet for a few seconds, then said it had happened to several others before. I asked if anyone knew who that woman was. Some say they're witches who work for the groups that move through those hills, that they climb the trees to keep watch on who comes and goes, to keep watch on us. But others say it has nothing to do with that the woman has been there far longer than any of us, long before there were soldiers, long before there was even a road. I don't know what she was, community. But I do know this. Since then, I believe in a lot of things I used to think were just legends. Hello, my name is Roger, and I'm from Quito, Ecuador. This happened to me during my voluntary military service. The barracks I was assigned to sat next to a large forest the army kept under guard. That forest already had a reputation among the people nearby. They said terrible things had happened there over the years. Murders, soldiers' suicides, even stories that during one president's time, opponents of the regime had been executed there. But what the instructors repeated to us most weren't those old stories. They warned us about two very specific things. The first was an area of the forest where several soldiers had taken their own lives by hanging themselves from the trees. They told us that if, during guard duty, we felt our shoulders growing strangely heavy, we should never turn around, because some swore that the hanged men would climb onto the backs of the sentries, as if trying to relieve the pressure they still felt around their necks. The second warning was even stranger. They told us that sometimes, in the early hours, very old women dressed in black would appear and try to enter the forest without permission. If we ever saw them, our job was to stop them from going in, but under no circumstances were we to let them touch us. The first time I drew guard duty there, I was assigned one of the heaviest shifts, from 2:30 in the morning until 6. My post ran from the firing range, which was essentially the entrance to the forest from the barracks, to the area where a path used by civilians began. I had to patrol that whole stretch on foot, a walk of about 20 minutes. That night it was cold, lightly raining, and there was thick fog. By the time I started climbing toward the area with the suicide trees, I was already on edge. You could barely see anything through the mist. As I walked, I began hearing branches snapping, as if someone were moving among the trees. Then came the whispers. At first, I couldn't make out what they were saying, but little by little I could distinguish several voices repeating the same thing. What I'm about to tell is hard to believe, and I myself remember it hazily, as if it had been a dream, as if I'd been somewhere between asleep and awake. The voices were saying, "Recruit, recruit, recruit." Then another word, "Attention, attention, recruit." And suddenly a loud shout, like a command. The fright was so great that I spun around immediately. When I shone my flashlight, I saw a man standing behind me. He was wearing a military uniform. For a second, I thought it was the duty sergeant. They used to show up unannounced to make sure no one fell asleep at their post. But something was wrong. The uniform looked old, very old. And when I raised the light a little higher, I could see his face. It was deep purple, almost black with bruising. In that moment, I remembered what the instructors had told us. I said nothing. I just turned around and kept walking. But as I moved forward, I started to feel something strange. My shoulders growing heavier and heavier, as if someone were leaning their weight onto me. I checked my watch. It was 3:31 in the morning.
"Attention, recruit!"
And then I heard the shout again. I don't know why, but in that moment I looked up, and I saw it. I believe it was the same soldier, this time standing on my shoulders. I could see the rope still hanging from his neck. I don't remember clearly what I was thinking in that moment. All that came out of me, almost by reflex, was, "Yes, Sergeant, let me patrol in peace. You should be resting now." I ran out of that area. Once I left the trees behind, I felt the weight disappear. I sat down for a moment to catch my breath. By then it was nearly 10 to 4. I decided not to go back through that part of the forest that night. A while later, I saw a light approaching down the path. It was the real duty sergeant, checking on the posts. I signed in for my shift, and he continued on his way. Everything seemed to have settled, but dawn was still a long way off. It must have been around 4:15 when I saw someone trying to enter the forest through the entrance. I grabbed my rifle and approached. When I called out, I saw the silhouette of a small woman, dressed entirely in black, with a veil. She spoke to me in an old woman's voice. "Good evening, young man. I'm just passing through. This is a shortcut to my son's house." In that moment, I remembered the other warning. I stepped back and told her the area was restricted until 6 in the morning. She began moving closer to me, at first speaking like a helpless old woman, saying she was elderly and needed my help. But as she advanced, her voice began to change, harder, an angry voice. She tried to take my hand. I just kept backing away, not letting her touch me. At one point I raised my rifle, purely on instinct. Just then I heard running footsteps. 2 young women, also dressed in black, came down the path and took the old woman by the arm. They said she was their grandmother, apologized, and led her away. They disappeared into the fog down the path. When dawn finally broke, I felt an enormous sense of relief. This also happened to me during my military service, at the same barracks I mentioned before. After that night in the forest, I was assigned another guard shift a few weeks later, but this time at a fixed post, a small lookout post somewhat removed from that area, though still within the forest. Same shift, 2:30 in the morning until 6. That cursed shift. That hour, everything in the barracks turns strange. The world seems to stop. You don't hear engines or voices, only the wind moving through the trees. Relief usually arrives about 5 minutes before the shift ends, so the equipment and orders can be handed over calmly. So when my shift began, I knew no one was supposed to show up before 6. The first half hour passed quietly, but around 4 the fog started rolling in again. Within minutes, everything was covered. You could barely make out even the nearest trees. I began hearing footsteps. The worst part was that it didn't sound like just one person. It was several footsteps running, and the most unsettling thing was that they seemed to be circling around the lookout post. I switched on my flashlight and shone it in every direction, but there was no one there. The footsteps continued for a few more minutes and then stopped abruptly. Silence returned. Just as I was starting to relax, I felt something very cold near my ear, like a draft of air, and right after that I heard a low whistle, very close. Then a voice. "Let's be friends. Yes?" I spun around immediately, and there was absolutely no one there. I won't lie. At that point I was very on edge. I just wanted my relief to arrive. A while later, from below the lookout post, I heard a familiar voice. "Sentry. Relief." I leaned out and saw, a few meters away, one of my fellow soldiers approaching. We slept in the same dormitory, so I recognized his voice right away. That confused me a little, since it was still far from 6. I called down to him. "Buddy, it's not time yet." He laughed a little and explained that he'd been punished, and that's why they'd sent him to relieve me early. It didn't seem all that strange to me. That kind of thing happens at the barracks, so I left my gear there, came down and left. As I walked away, I noticed something odd. It had suddenly gotten very cold, but at the time I honestly didn't think much of it. By the time I got to the dormitory, almost no one was still awake. I lay down but couldn't fall asleep. Around 5:30, the alarms of the other soldiers who had to go relieve the 6 o'clock post started going off, and everyone began getting up. And then I saw something that truly made the blood drain from my head. My fellow soldier, the very one who had supposedly relieved me, was still in his bed, just barely getting up. He looked at me and said, "Body, what are you doing here? Weren't you on guard duty?" I didn't know what to say. I just told him I hadn't been feeling well and had left my gear with the duty sergeant, but he went off to do his own relief shift as usual. To this day, I still don't know who relieved me that night. To make sense of what happened to me a few years ago, I have to go back much further, to my grandfather. My grandfather's name was Samuel. When he was about 16 years old, he lived in a small village and used to sneak out at night to visit my grandmother, because back then her parents did not approve of the relationship. He always told the story of one of those nights when he was walking near the village slaughterhouse and heard someone calling to him from the darkness. "Samuel, come. Come closer. I don't bite." The voice came from the very blackest part of the night. After those words, he heard a laugh. One he said still made his skin crawl whenever he remembered it. My grandfather took off running immediately, and as he ran, he tripped over something in the road and fell. When he looked up, he saw a figure standing in front of him. He said it was an animal, more than 2 meters tall, its skin dark, almost black, with very little hair. What he remembered most were the legs. They ended in hooves, like a pig's, and on its face it had horns and a mouthful of teeth that clattered against each other, making a very strange sound. My grandfather lost consciousness. From fear, from the shock, who knows? The next thing he remembered was waking up at my grandmother's house. Her brother had found him lying in the road on his way back from a dance, and had carried him to the house for help. It took my grandfather many years before he told anyone what he had seen that night. The years passed. My grandparents married and had 7 children. They bought a small house where all my aunts and uncles grew up. But strange things began happening in that house. Apparitions, noises at night, shadows moving down the hallways. My family says that over time they simply got used to living like that, with it. One of my aunts, for example, was sweeping the patio one day when she felt a very strong gust of wind that scattered all the leaves she had been gathering. For some reason, from that day on, she began suffering seizures that no one could ever explain. Over the years, 2 of my uncles died in tragic ways. One drowned, and another fell ill with something that took him within a week. Around that time, there was a man close to the family who claimed to have the gift of seeing into other planes. When he went to the wake for one of my uncles, he asked to speak with my grandfather alone. He told him that something had followed him since that night at the slaughterhouse, that it had attached itself to him, and that he had seen it from the moment he first walked into that house. Sometime later, they actually tried to perform a ritual to remove it, but according to my grandfather, they were never able to finish the work, for one reason or another. A long time after that, I was born. When I was small, my parents lived for a while in Chiapas, where my paternal grandmother lived. My mom always says that my grandmother would say I had a gift, that I was going to carry on that tradition. When I was about 2 years old, I used to talk a lot to someone I called the old man. And everyone except my grandmother thought it was just an imaginary friend, the way it happens with a lot of small children. But one day my grandmother confirmed her suspicions. She was lying down watching over me when she heard a noise coming from the altar she kept in the house. When she went to look, she saw something that, according to her, looked like a hunched old man, sitting down, with me between his legs. She said the old man's hands looked like pincers. She shouted a prayer and ran toward me, and the thing took off running. She said it was as if it had simply vanished from the room it had entered, leaving behind only a very strong smell, like something rotting. My mom was deeply frightened by what my grandmother described and decided to distance herself from that side of the family. The years passed, and it all seemed to stay in the past. By the time I was around 18, I moved to Mexico City. I was working at a coffee shop while finishing high school. One day, a woman I had never seen before came into the cafe and, out of nowhere, said to me, "You've been carrying a dead person with you for a long time." Without my asking anything, she told me that someone had offered me something so I could see things others couldn't see. She handed me a card and told me that if I didn't believe what she was saying, that very night I would. I swear I thought she was out of her mind. I don't know what you all would have thought. But that night, something did happen. I was living with 2 cousins. One of them was home with me. I was in my room doing homework when my cousin asked me from the doorway if I wanted coffee or tea. I said coffee. Suddenly we heard noise coming from the kitchen, as if someone were going through the drawers. We went to check. Everything was in its place. The pots, the drawers, all of it, completely fine. We went back to the room without understanding what had happened. We turned off the light and then, "Do you want coffee or tea?" We heard a voice right behind us. We turned off the light and then, "Do you want coffee or tea?" We heard a voice right behind us. We ran out of the room. That night we huddled together in the living room. The noises continued throughout the night in different parts of the house, but at least we didn't hear that voice again. The next day, I remembered the card the woman had given me and decided to call her. She told me to come to her house in Naucalpan. I went with my cousin. When we arrived, they let us in. There was another person there with her, a man whose mere presence made me uncomfortable. They had me sit down and began performing a ritual, burning herbs, praying in an indigenous language. In the middle of all that, I caught a horrible smell, like something dead, and I heard a whisper right behind me, one she didn't seem to have heard. "Hello again." After a while, the woman said it was finished, that I had been carrying a dead spirit attached to me since childhood, and that my grandmother had been the one who summoned it. Then she charged me for her services. I thought that would be the end of it, but it was the opposite. Things started getting worse. Noises in the house, doors slamming shut on their own for no reason, flies appearing out of nowhere. Until one night something happened that still strikes me as even worse. Truly horrible. I was on a video call with my boyfriend. We were talking about a trip we wanted to take when suddenly he laughed, nervously, and said, "Say hi to your cousin for me." I told him I was alone in the house. He insisted. He said he'd been seeing someone walking behind me for a while, and that just then someone had leaned into the doorway as if trying to listen in on the conversation. I felt my whole body start to shake. I went down the stairs to get out of the house, and as I did, I felt something touch my shoulder. I walked quickly and reached the living room, and before I turned on the hallway light, I saw something in the dark. A man sitting at the head of the dining table, his hands folded together as if in prayer. He didn't lift his head. A few seconds passed, literally 3 or 4, and then he stood up. That was when I ran for the door. I wasn't going to wait around to find out what he was going to do. I went out into the small front yard, sat outside facing a neighbor's apartment, crying while I waited for the taxi I had called on my phone. From there, before I left, I could see the lights turning on inside my house and shadows moving behind the curtains, as if there were several people inside. I'm writing my story today because I no longer know what to do. Because I'm hoping there's someone in this community who might be able to help me, here on Tales of the Night. Just a few days ago, I went back to my hometown. Someone very close to me told me that what my grandfather saw all those years ago is still here. That it isn't only in the village, that it's with me. Even now, as I write this on the bus back to Mexico City, I feel as though someone is breathing behind the seat where I'm sitting. A seat I know is empty.